The 19th of October 2019, Salem, Idaho, USA. Tammy Daybell, 49, passed away at the Daybell family home. She was the longtime wife of Chad Daybell, with whom she had built a family and raised children over the years. At the time, her death was not treated as a homicide. The initial cause was recorded as a cardiac event. No autopsy was performed immediately afterward. Tammy was laid to rest, and there appeared to be no clear reason to believe her death would eventually become the focal point of a high-profile criminal investigation across the United States. Yet, just over 2 weeks later, an unexpected development occurred. The 5th of November, 2019. Chad Daybell married Lori Vallow in Hawaii. The brief interval between Tammy's death and the new marriage immediately became a significant detail as subsequent events were pieced together. For by then, the story involved a far more serious issue. Lori's 2 children had not been seen for weeks. Their disappearance would draw law enforcement into an increasingly complex search. Timelines were scrutinized. Relationships were examined. Explanations were cross-referenced. And ultimately, the investigation into the missing children led authorities back to the woman who had supposedly died of natural causes. Tammy Daybell. A death that had seemingly been resolved now had to be re-examined from the beginning. If Tammy had truly died from a medical event, why did her case later become a crucial part of the investigation into the missing children? And how did these seemingly separate stories ultimately converge around the same group of people? To understand that, one must turn back the clock. For Tammy is not the only name to have suddenly vanished from the lives of those around her, nor is she the first person to disappear from this story.
Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future true crime documentaries based on official case files, witness testimony, and verified evidence.
Before the name Tammy Daybell appeared in news reports across the United States, she had lived a life spanning decades in entirely different roles. Her full name was Tammy Daybell. On the 9th of March 1990, Tammy married Chad Daybell. At the time, no one could have known that this marriage would eventually become part of a case followed nationwide nearly 30 years later. But this is not the moment to discuss the events of 2019. For Tammy lived a life that deserves to be recognized on its own terms, apart from all that followed. She built a family, became a mother, and spent years raising her children. Over time, the Daybell family went through various phases before eventually moving to Salem, Idaho. Yet, Tammy's life was not defined solely by her role within the family. She was also actively involved in the business the couple built together. Tammy and Chad founded Spring Creek Book Company. In their publishing work, Chad's name was the one that usually appeared on the books. Tammy handled the less visible yet essential tasks required to keep the company running. She managed the finances. She contributed to book cover designs. These were roles demanding time, organization, and constant responsibility behind every publication. So, when looking back at old photographs, Tammy should not be seen merely as the woman standing beside Chad. Consider Tammy in her youth. Then, the wedding photo from 1990, the years as their family took shape, moments spent with her children. Her work at Spring Creek Book Company. Each image adds a piece to a life that existed long before any criminal investigation began. This is particularly important in a story where the name of the perpetrator can so easily overshadow the name of the victim. Tammy was not simply Chad Daybell's wife. She had her own name, a job, responsibilities, family ties, and a life built over the course of decades. Tammy and Chad's marriage ultimately spanned nearly 3 decades, nearly 30 years of shared history, family, and life's changes. But in the final years of the marriage, a new figure entered the story. That arrival would prove to be a pivotal turning point for everything that followed. In 2018, Chad Daybell met another woman. Her name was Lori Vallow. Chad Daybell spent nearly 3 decades by Tammy's side. He worked as an author and publisher, focusing on a rather niche genre of content. Chad's works often explored themes related to the apocalypse, near-death experiences, religion, and spiritual beliefs. This niche allowed him to connect with a community of readers who shared his interests. Behind his publishing career lay a life built with Tammy since 1990. They had children together. They navigated the various stages of family life. They ran Spring Creek Book Company together, though each handled distinct roles. Chad focused on writing and publishing. Tammy managed the behind-the-scenes responsibilities, such as finances and design. From the outside, it appeared to be a relationship that had endured through most of their adult lives. However, one should not paint Chad as the perfect husband simply because of this. The case record does not require such a facade to create a contrast. The crucial factor here is timing, for after nearly 30 years of life with Tammy, in the autumn of 2018, Chad attended an event that would introduce a completely new figure into his life. October 2018. A conference titled Preparing a People was held in St. George, Utah. It was a gathering for people interested in religious topics and in preparing for future events they believed might come to pass. Chad attended the event, and it was there that he met Lori Vallow. At the time of their meeting, both were still living within their respective family lives. Tammy was still Chad's wife. The couple had shared nearly 3 decades of marriage. Lori, too, brought with her a personal family history and relationships that would later become significant during the investigation. At first, nothing about a meeting at the conference hinted at the scale of the events to come. But from that point on, 2 previously separate paths began to converge. On one side was the Daybell family in Idaho. On the other was Lori and the people closest to her. In the months that followed, the bond between Chad and Lori deepened. At the same time, unusual events began to unfold around both families. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, the meeting in St. George emerged as a pivotal moment. Not because the meeting itself was evidence of a crime, but because, from that moment on, names that previously had no reason to appear in the same file began to draw closer together. Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow, Chad's family, Lori's children, and, ultimately, Tammy. October 2018 thus became the link between 2 seemingly unrelated worlds. A meeting in Utah brought the 2 families together, and the ensuing events would ultimately place 3 deaths at the heart of a single criminal case. Following their meeting in Utah, the most notable aspect wasn't merely the growing closeness between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. Another layer began to take shape around their relationship, a shared belief system. It is important to draw a clear line here. One should not label the case with concepts like coercive control or gaslighting unless the evidence confirms them. More significant indicators emerge directly from the legal proceedings. Red flag 1. The belief system. According to the indictment, on the 26th of October 2018, Chad and Lori began discussing how to use their religious beliefs to justify the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. This is not a psychological conclusion drawn by the narrator. It is an allegation included by the prosecution in the criminal case file. This detail is particularly significant because it shows that the concepts Chad and Lori shared were not viewed by investigators merely as unconventional spiritual ideas. According to the prosecution's case, these beliefs became part of how grave actions were rationalized between the 2. And in the months that followed, that connection evolved in yet another direction. Red flag 2. The romantic relationship. By July 2019, investigators later determined that Chad and Lori were exchanging romantic messages. In these conversations, they used 2 names, James and Elena. These names became a way to refer to their relationship. At that time, Tammy was still alive. She remained Chad's wife after nearly 3 decades of marriage. Thus, there was no longer just a connection forged through shared views. There was also a romantic relationship between Chad and Lori, one kept separate from their existing marriages. 2 layers began to overlap, a secret romance and a shared belief system. But even so, the affair shouldn't be viewed as the sole explanation for the entire case. What makes the timeline remarkable is the sequence of events that began to unfold around the 2 of them. Red flag 3, 2 parallel worlds. Back in Idaho, Tammy was living the life she had built over decades. A marriage dating back to 1990. Children, a job. Spring Creek Book Company. The home in Salem. That was a world that had existed long before Lori came along. Meanwhile, Chad was becoming increasingly drawn to a different path. A path that led to Lori. Private messages, secret nicknames, and the very belief system that the prosecution would later argue played a pivotal role in the crimes. Those 2 realities coexisted, but the gap between them was becoming harder to maintain. Then, the summer of 2019 came to an end. September began, and from that point on, the story changed completely. Because what happened next could no longer be simply explained by a troubled marriage or a clandestine affair. A member of Lori's family was no longer seen. Not an adult who had chosen to leave, but a child. By September 2019, the story of Chad and Lori had entered a far more serious phase. Tylee Ryan vanished from everyday life. And the Daybell case, there is no single moment that can be definitively identified as the trigger for everything that followed. Rather than a sudden, isolated incident, the timeline reveals a succession of events. And the most critical period began in September 2019. September 8th, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan went on a trip to Yellowstone National Park with her family. Images from that trip would later become particularly significant. That was the last time Tylee was seen in publicly confirmed evidence showing her with her family. After that day, Tylee gradually disappeared from everyday life. At the time, however, there was no large-scale missing person investigation focusing public attention on Lori's family. Then, just 1 day after the Yellowstone trip, another event was recorded on the timeline. September 9th, Alex Cox, Lori's brother, appeared at Chad Daybell's property in Idaho. That same day, Chad sent a text message to Tammy. He told her he had seen a raccoon on the property. According to the message, Chad said he had shot the animal and buried it in the backyard. When Tammy received that explanation, there was no obvious reason for her to interpret it any other way. But months later, when investigators returned to that very property, the message about the raccoon would be viewed in an entirely new light. 2 weeks passed. Then, another child stopped appearing in public. The 23rd of September, 2019. 7-year-old JJ Vallow was last seen at Kennedy Elementary School. JJ was at an age where his daily life typically revolved around school, teachers, and a relatively stable routine. But then, Lori announced that she would switch to homeschooling her son. This brought about a crucial change. JJ no longer needed to show up for class every day. Consequently, his absence didn't immediately trigger the kind of alarm bells that might arise when a student suddenly stops attending school without explanation. By the end of September, neither of Lori's children was appearing in their usual public activities. Tylee, 16 years old. JJ, 7 years old. 2 different ages, 2 different lives. Yet, a void now existed where they once were, and outsiders had no idea what that void truly signified. Meanwhile, Chad's life in Salem went on. Tammy was still there, still his wife, still living in the house on the property where, just weeks earlier, Chad had claimed to bury a raccoon in the backyard. There was no clear line marking the moment the story entered a more dangerous phase. There were simply days following one another. A teenage girl no longer seen, a man appearing on the property, a text message about something buried in the backyard. Then, a young boy stopped going to school. Any single event might not have been enough for outsiders to see the full picture. But when investigators later pieced them together, September 2019 emerged as a timeline that could not be ignored. And less than a month after JJ was last seen, Tammy Daybell passed away. By then, the two children were no longer appearing in public. Yet, there was still no missing person investigation significant enough to tie all these disparate threads into a single case file. That was about to change. The 19th of October 2019, in Salem, Idaho, Tammy Daybell passed away at the age of 49. Nearly 3 decades earlier, she had married Chad. Together, they built a family, raised children, and worked in publishing. But on that morning, Tammy's life came to an abrupt end. Initially, authorities recorded the cause as a cardiac event. The assessment at the time pointed to a medical incident. No autopsy was performed immediately following her death. Tammy was subsequently laid to rest. Had the story ended there, October 19 might simply be remembered as a tragedy for the Daybell family. However, the months that followed would compel authorities to revisit that very moment and view everything from a completely different perspective. It is important to respect the limitations of the record. Available public documents do not provide a minute-by-minute timeline of Tammy's final hours. Therefore, we will not reconstruct conversations between her and Chad. We will not attribute a final statement to Tammy. We will not pinpoint exactly where individuals were standing inside the house, nor will we turn unverified details into a dramatized scene. What we know for certain is far simpler. Tammy died. The cause was initially recorded as a cardiac event. No autopsy was performed immediately, and at the time, her case did not bear the hallmarks of the murder investigation the public would later come to know. It is precisely that initial appearance of normalcy that makes the overall timeline so remarkable. For in the weeks leading up to Tammy's death, a different chain of events had been quietly unfolding. On September 8, Tylee Ryan was last seen during a trip to Yellowstone. On September 9, Alex Cox was present at the Daybell property. On that same day, Chad texted his wife about shooting a raccoon and burying it in the backyard. On September 23, JJ Vallow was last seen at Kennedy Elementary School. Lori subsequently announced that the boy would be switching to homeschooling. At the time, these milestones were not viewed as parts of the same picture. The Yellowstone trip was just a trip. The text message about the raccoon was an incident that occurred on the property. JJ's departure from school was explained by homeschooling, and Tammy's passing was attributed to initial medical causes. Each detail stood in isolation. Only later, when investigators arranged them in chronological order, did the intervals between the events become significant. September 8, Tylee was last seen. September 9, Alex was present at the Daybell property. Chad sent a text message about something that had just been buried in the backyard. September 23, JJ left his familiar school routine. October 19, Tammy passed away. Then, the timeline moved forward. Just 17 days after the death of the wife he had lived with for nearly 30 years, Chad Daybell traveled to Hawaii. On November 5, he married Lori Vallow. The short span of time between the two events certainly draws attention in retrospect. However, a quick remarriage does not, in itself, prove any criminal allegations. What made it significant was the context that gradually came to light afterward. Tylee had vanished from all traces of her familiar life. So had JJ. Tammy had just been laid to rest. Chad and Lori were now husband and wife. But authorities did not yet have the full picture. The turning point came only when relatives began to worry about JJ. A welfare check would be conducted. An explanation regarding the boy's whereabouts would be verified. That explanation would ultimately fail. From there, investigators began tracing the timeline backward. They looked for JJ, then for Tylee. They continued to examine the people surrounding the two children. And finally, attention turned back to Tammy Daybell, a woman whose case had once been considered resolved with a medical explanation, now became part of a broader investigation. In retrospect, October 19th took on a very different significance. The crucial detail was not found at a crime scene teeming with clues. It lay in the exact opposite. At first, everything seemed ordinary enough for the matter to be closed. It was only when investigators placed Tammy's death alongside the disappearances of Tylee and JJ that the real questions began. And from that point, a case that seemed to be over was about to be reopened from scratch. There was no immediate flight following the 19th of October 2019. The current record does not support the idea of a sequence of actions involving cleaning up a scene and then vanishing from Idaho. Instead, what made the subsequent phase remarkable was the pace of events. Tammy Daybell had just passed away. Her death was initially recorded as a cardiac event. She was laid to rest. Then, just over 2 weeks later, Chad's life took a completely different turn. The 5th of November 2019, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were married in Hawaii. This was a significant milestone. However, a quick remarriage does not, in itself, prove a crime. Its significance only truly changed when viewed alongside what authorities did not yet know at the time. Tylee Ryan had not been seen for weeks. JJ Vallow was no longer attending school either. As Chad and Lori embarked on their new marriage, the absence of the two children remained unexplained. Then, by late November, that void finally drew the direct attention of law enforcement. November 26. Following concerns raised by Kay Woodcock, JJ's grandmother, authorities arrived to conduct a welfare check. The objective was simple. They wanted to know JJ's whereabouts and confirm his safety. When questioned, Lori offered an explanation. According to her, JJ was not with her. He was staying with Melanie Gibb, a friend of hers. If that information were accurate, the police would simply need to confirm JJ's presence there. But then, a problem arose with the story. Melanie Gibb stated JJ was not with her. It was an explanation that could be instantly verified, and it turned out to be untrue. This was the moment the nature of the story began to shift. Authorities were no longer dealing merely with a child whom relatives could not contact. They were also working with incorrect information regarding the child's whereabouts. And as the police continued their search, another question quickly arose. Where was Tylee? Tylee had last been seen back in September. There was no confirmation of JJ's safety either. Now, two disappearances previously viewed as separate matters began to merge into a single investigation. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old. JJ Vallow, 7 years old. Authorities needed to find them both. But before those questions could be answered, Chad and Lori left Idaho. On the 1st of December 2019, the couple flew to Hawaii. The geography changed. The questions did not. Where was JJ? Where was Tylee? Why did Lori claim JJ was with Melanie when that wasn't true? And as investigators began to piece together the preceding months, another name kept appearing close to that timeline. Tammy Daybell, a woman who had passed away just weeks before the welfare check. A death once viewed as a natural medical event now stood alongside a chain of events that was becoming increasingly difficult to untangle. Yet, the turning point wasn't Tammy not yet. It began with a simple question to which Lori could not provide a verifiable answer. Where was JJ? An explanation had crumbled, and the police now had to search for not just one, but two children. From late November 2019, the investigation began to shift rapidly. It wasn't because the police immediately knew what had happened. Rather, Every piece of information they verified opened up a new gap, and the first discovery stemmed from Lori's own explanation. Discovery 1. JJ was not with Melanie. On November 26, authorities conducted a welfare check to determine if JJ was safe. Lori stated that her son was staying with Melanie Gibb. It was a specific piece of information, a location that could be checked, a person who could confirm it. But when authorities contacted Melanie, the stories didn't match. JJ was not with her. At this point, the issue was no longer simply a child temporarily out of sight of his relatives. The police had discovered that the explanation regarding JJ's whereabouts could not be verified, and that immediately compelled them to broaden the scope of their inquiry. Discovery 2. Tylee was also missing. As investigators began to piece together the life of Lori's family, another question arose. Where was Tylee Ryan? Tylee had not been seen since September. Her last confirmed sighting was linked to a trip to Yellowstone National Park on September 8th. JJ, too, had disappeared from his usual routine after September 23. 2 children, 2 different timelines, and neither child could be confirmed safe by authorities. Now, the police were no longer just seeking answers regarding JJ's case. They had to reconstruct the movements of both JJ and Tylee. But as the timeline expanded, another event emerged right in the middle of that period. The death of Tammy Daybell. Discovery 3. Tammy re-enters the timeline. On the 20th of December 2019, the Rexburg police publicly announced that JJ and Tylee were missing. Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were identified as persons of interest regarding the children's disappearance. But the police revealed an even more significant detail. Investigators stated they believed the disappearance of JJ and Tylee might be linked to the death of Tammy Daybell. This marked a major turning point. After all, just 2 months earlier, Tammy had not been the subject of a murder investigation. Her death was initially recorded as a cardiac event. No autopsy was performed at the time. She had already been laid to rest. But now, the case no longer stood in isolation. Police began to see a sequence of events. Tylee stopped appearing in public. Then JJ did the same. Next, Tammy passed away. Just over 2 weeks later, Chad married Lori. Then, Lori provided false information regarding JJ's whereabouts. Events that might once have been viewed in isolation were now aligning on a single timeline. But there was another problem. The 2 individuals from whom investigators needed answers were no longer in Idaho. Discovery 4. Hawaii. Authorities determined that Chad and Lori were in Hawaii. The couple had left Idaho in early December. However, the change in location did not make the questions about the children disappear. Lori was ordered to produce JJ and Tylee so authorities could confirm their safety. The deadline passed. It did not happen. No JJ, no Tylee, and still, there was no verifiable explanation as to where the children were. By this point, the investigation had gone far beyond a simple welfare check. Authorities were dealing with a mother who could not produce her children. An explanation regarding JJ's whereabouts had already been debunked. The 2 children had not been seen for months, and a prior death was being re-examined in the same context. On the 20th of February 2020, Lori Vallow was arrested in Hawaii. But Lori's arrest still hadn't resolved the most important issue. Investigators were able to determine her whereabouts. They knew where Chad was. They could reconstruct the day Tylee was last seen. They could pinpoint when JJ stopped attending school. They could revisit the circumstances of Tammy's death. But the question that sparked the entire search remained unanswered. Where was JJ Vallow? And now, another question arose. Where was Tylee Ryan? Police had uncovered inconsistencies. They had pieced together the timelines. They had located Chad and Lori. But they still hadn't found the 2 children. By early 2020, investigators were faced with a troubling series of events. The 2 children were no longer seen. The explanation regarding JJ's whereabouts remained unverified. Chad and Lori had left Idaho. Lori was subsequently arrested in Hawaii. Yet, a massive gap remained. No one had found JJ or Tylee. To move forward, investigators had to revisit the timeline from before anyone even knew the children were missing. And one of the names re-examined was Tammy Daybell. Development 1 re-examining Tammy's death. On the 19th of October 2019, Tammy's death was initially recorded as a cardiac event. No autopsy was performed at the time. Had it not been for subsequent developments, her case might have remained closed based on that initial explanation. But the search for JJ and Tylee changed the context. Investigators began to view Tammy's death in a new light. A woman had passed away. Her husband remarried just over 2 weeks later. His new wife had 2 children who had not been seen for weeks, and the police publicly suggested that these events might be connected. Tammy's body was exhumed for re-examination. An autopsy was subsequently completed. At this stage, there is no need to go beyond what the documentation confirms. No adding forensic results. No speculating on the method of death. The crucial point is that a death once viewed as a medical event had now become part of a broader criminal investigation. But investigators possessed another type of evidence, something that did not rely on anyone's memory. Development to digital evidence and timelines. Police began to compare the timelines side by side. Don't look at events in isolation. Look at the sequence in which they occurred. Tylee Ryan was last seen on the 8th of September 2019 during a trip to Yellowstone. The following day, September 9, Alex Cox appeared at Chad's property in Salem. That same day, Chad sent Tammy a text message about an incident on the property. He said he had shot a raccoon and then buried it in the backyard. At the time the message was sent, it might have seemed like just an ordinary story about what Chad was doing on his property. But investigators now know something Tammy couldn't have known back then. Tylee had just vanished from the timeline, and Alex Cox was present on that very property the next day. Then came JJ. On September 23, the boy was last seen at Kennedy Elementary School. Lori switched JJ to homeschooling. Then he, too, disappeared from his daily routine. Investigators also have messages exchanged between Chad and Lori. There is evidence of their relationship. There is activity involving Alex. There are time frames linked to the Daybell property. No single piece of data solves the entire case on its own. But when placed in the correct sequence, they begin to narrow the scope of the search. Sept 8, Tylee last seen. Sept 9, Alex appears at the Daybell property. Same day, Chad texts Tammy about burying a raccoon in the backyard. A message that once seemed unremarkable is now viewed in a completely different context. And finally, investigators return to the very place where Chad had lived with Tammy. Clue 3, Chad Daybell's property. The 9th of June, 2020. Law enforcement conducted a search of Chad's property in Salem, Idaho. This was the property that had appeared repeatedly in the timeline. The place where Alex had been. The place where Chad had told Tammy he buried a raccoon. And now, the police began searching there. During the search, investigators discovered human remains. The months-long search finally reached the moment the children's families dreaded most. What was found was subsequently confirmed to belong to Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow. The 2 children authorities had been searching for since late 2019 were not with Melanie Gibb. They had not appeared elsewhere in Idaho. They were not in Hawaii. The final answer lay on Chad Daybell's property. This discovery changed the entire nature of the case. It was no longer just an investigation into missing children with unanswered questions. Investigators now had a physical location directly linking the case to Chad. They had a timeline. They had digital evidence. They had messages that needed to be placed in the proper context. And there was another death, Tammy Daybell's being re-examined. After months of tracing explanations, timelines, and digital footprints, the search for JJ and Tylee finally led back to a place that had surfaced early on in the story, Chad Daybell's backyard. But finding the children answered only the question of where they were. The next question would be far more difficult. Who was responsible for what happened to Tylee, JJ, and Tammy? On the 9th of June 2020, the search of Chad Daybell's property in Salem completely shifted the direction of the case. After months of having no answers regarding the whereabouts of JJ and Tylee, investigators finally found the two children on the very land owned by Chad. However, at that stage, legal protocols had to be strictly observed. Chad had not yet been charged with murder. Investigators still needed to determine each person's role, gather evidence, and build a case that would hold up in court. Just one day after the search, on the 10th of June 2020, Chad Daybell was arrested. The initial charges focused on the destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence. This was a major turning point, but not the end of the road. While finding JJ and Tylee answered the question that had persisted for months, where were the two children? It did not automatically answer another question: who exactly did what? And this is where the Daybell case differs from cases like that of Chris Watts. There was no central confession that caused the entire story to suddenly unravel in an interrogation room. There was no moment where Chad sat before investigators and offered a confession that explained everything. Instead, the prosecution's case was built by piecing together multiple layers of evidence. A timeline, the final moments when Tylee and JJ were seen alive. Digital evidence, text messages, data, and communications that helped investigators reconstruct the relationships and activities of those involved. Location evidence, timeframes linked to the Daybell property, witness testimony, accounts from people who had interacted with Chad, Lori, and their family members, forensic evidence, results gathered as the investigation continued to expand, and finally, physical evidence inextricably linked to the location. JJ and Tylee were found on Chad's property. Individual pieces of evidence should not be presented as if any single one proves the entire case on its own. The strength of the case lies in how the prosecution eventually weaves them together. Dates linked to data, data linked to testimony, testimony cross-referenced with locations, and locations leading back to the property in Salem. Meanwhile, Tammy's death was no longer excluded from the record. What was initially viewed as a cardiac event had now undergone forensic review and a fresh investigation. The investigation continued to expand, and over time, the allegations against Chad went beyond the concealment or alteration of evidence. The case evolved to include far more serious charges: murder and conspiracy. This marked the true turning point in the Daybell case. It wasn't a confession. It was a case built layer by layer, where seemingly disparate events began to converge. Tylee, JJ, Tammy, Chad, Lori, Alex Cox, and the Salem property. From a death initially treated as a medical event and two missing children, investigators were now dealing with a case involving multiple victims and murder charges. Yet, to turn those allegations into convictions, the prosecution still had to prove to the jury that all these pieces truly belonged to a single, unified plot. After years of investigation, the case that began with two missing children finally reached the courtroom. However, a key distinction must be made. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell were not tried together. On the 2nd of March, 2023, Judge Stephen Boyce decided to sever the two trials. This meant the prosecution had to present separate cases before different juries, and Lori was the first to stand trial. Lori Vallow Daybell. Lori's trial began in Idaho on the 3rd of April, 2023. This was no longer just a story about a failed welfare check or 2 children simply reported missing. The jury was now presented with a broader case, a sequence of events spanning many months. Tylee's disappearance, JJ's absence, explanations regarding the children's whereabouts, the relationship between Lori and Chad, digital evidence, witness testimony, activities reconstructed by investigators along a timeline, and finally, the discovery of JJ and Tylee on Chad's property in Salem. The prosecution had to prove Lori's criminal liability using the evidence presented to the jury. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of those facts. After weeks of testimony, the case was handed over to the jury. On the 12th of May 2023, the verdict was announced. Guilty. Lori was convicted on charges related to murder, conspiracy, and grand theft within the broader case. But the verdict was not the final step. On the 31st of July 2023, Lori returned to court for sentencing. The outcome? Life imprisonment. Legally, the portion of the case involving Lori in Idaho had reached a significant conclusion, but there was still another defendant, Chad Daybell. Chad's case followed a separate path. Following the decision on the 2nd of March 2023, he was no longer set to stand trial alongside Lori. Chad continued to deny the charges and faced a separate trial. According to the timeline in the documents we are using, Chad's trial was scheduled to begin on the 1st of April, 2024. And this is where we must stop if the narrative is based solely on the current set of documents. The source material being used does not contain the final verdict and sentencing for Chad from 2024. Therefore, one should not take external results and quietly graft them in as if they belong to the same source. At the end of this timeline, Lori Vallow Daybell had been convicted by a jury and sentenced to life imprisonment. Meanwhile, Chad Daybell was still awaiting a separate trial, according to the records we are tracking. This creates an important distinction between what had been proven to the jury and what at the time the documents were created remained merely criminal allegations against Chad. For no matter how complex a case may be, that fundamental principle holds true. An investigation produces evidence. The prosecution presents allegations. But it is the court and the jury that determine what has been legally proven. Let us step away from the courtroom for a moment. The story does not end with Chad. It does not stop with Lori. We must not let the accused or the convicted become the final image of this narrative. For behind the thousands of pages of case files, the hearings, and the years of investigation, there were 3 human beings who lived their own lives long before their names became linked in this single case. First, there was Tammy Daybell, 49 years old. Nearly 3 decades of marriage defined the greater part of her adult life. Tammy built a family. She raised children. She worked in publishing. At Spring Creek Book Company, she handled the behind-the-scenes work, such as finances and cover design. Such details are easily overshadowed when a case gains notoriety. After 2019, Tammy's name was frequently mentioned alongside Chad Daybell's, but she did not begin her life as the wife of a defendant, nor should she be remembered solely for the circumstances of her death. When Tammy passed away on the 19th of October, 2019, her death was initially viewed as a medical event. At the time, no one could have known that Tammy's name would eventually be linked with 2 others. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, a teenager with her entire adult life still ahead of her. The last confirmed image of Tylee dates back to a trip to Yellowstone in September 2019, a seemingly ordinary family outing. But after that day, Tylee vanished from everyday life. Then there was Joshua J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, a young boy of school age. The last time JJ was seen in that familiar setting was at Kennedy Elementary School. He was subsequently switched to homeschooling, and then, JJ's daily presence disappeared as well. For months, the question regarding both children consisted of just a few words. Where is Tylee? Where is JJ? The family waited. Authorities searched. The public watched. But when the final answer came in June 2020, the search could not bring the children home. That is why this story should not end with the verdicts and sentences. A verdict can establish criminal liability. A sentence can determine the punishment, but neither can restore the years the victim should have lived. For Tammy, it is the life beyond age 49 that she never got to live. For Tylee, it is an adulthood that never began. For JJ, it is the childhood years that lay ahead. So, when the final images appear, let the courtroom fade away. No prison bars, no mugshots, no images of Chad or Lori. Instead, Tammy, a pause, Tylee, then JJ, photos of them while they were alive, family moments. Finally, a memorial, and the screen slowly goes dark. Because before becoming three names in the middle of a complex criminal case, Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and JJ Vallow all had lives that should have continued. Some cases begin with a crime scene that makes it immediately clear a crime has been committed. The Daybell case was different. The truth only gradually came to light as investigators pieced together events that had seemed unrelated. 2 missing children, a death initially deemed natural, and secrets held by the living. Sometimes, the most crucial element lies not in a single clue, but in the connections between details that appear entirely separate.